In the heart of the Wild West, a woman confronts the legacy of her father's theft, holding a mysterious pocket watch that 8 men will risk everything to claim. Will she protect time itself, or will the desert reveal secrets long buried? Watch as tension, honor, and destiny collide. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story of courage and reckoning. The cabin sat at the farthest edge of the desert, where the sun bled red across the horizon each morning, and silence stretched long enough to make a person believe the world had forgotten them. She had lived there for years, a figure both fragile and hardened, with eyes that no longer sought the future but instead clung to the past. In her hand, every dawn without fail, she held her father's watch, a tarnished silver thing. Its glass cracked, its ticking faint but unyielding, like the heartbeat of a ghost that refused to die. It was the only inheritance left to her, though. It felt less like a keepsake and more like a curse, for each time the watch ticked, it whispered a memory she had tried to bury. Her father had been a man carved from both steel and shadows, a man who never walked without leaving debt or blood in his path. He had told her once long ago, "Time is the only thing worth stealing, girl, because it always runs out." She had not understood then, but she did now. Every second felt stolen, and every moment was borrowed against something unnamed. The watch was heavy in her palm, though it weighed no more than a sparrow. The weight came from the silence it carried, the kind of silence that lived between her and the man who had once wound it and whispered to it as if it answered him. She could almost hear him still when the night was thick, his voice curling through the cracks of the cabin walls like smoke. Some nights she believed she lived not alone, but with the ghost of a man who had refused to take his last breath clean. The desert respected silence, but it did not forgive it, and on that morning, when she sat on the porch, the earth itself seemed restless, as though it knew what was riding toward her. The first sign was not dust, not hoofbeats, but the sudden pause in the ticking of the watch. She pressed it to her ear, frowning, and in that pause the desert shifted. Then it began again, louder, sharper, as though to warn her that time itself had turned. She looked up, eyes narrowing against the sunrise, and for the first time in years, she felt a chill slip beneath her skin. Across the horizon, where the sky touched the sand, she saw movement. Dark shapes against the gold, 8 of them, slow. At first but steady, horses pressing forward with the inevitability of storms. She did not move, only closed her fingers tight around the watch, as if the world might take it from her if she showed weakness. The riders came closer, dust trailing behind them like smoke, and she knew, before they even spoke, that they had not come for water, nor shelter, nor mercy. They had come for the watch. They had come for the time her father had stolen. And though her blood ran cold, she understood something else too. The watch was no longer only hers to keep. Why do you think 8 riders came for her father's watch? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The night had grown heavy, thick with the kind of silence that made even the cracking of her own fire seem like an intrusion. Miriam sat at the cabin's small, uneven table, the weight of her father's silver pocket watch pressing against her, palm like a relic too stubborn to let go of the past. The firelight caught the edges of the tarnished case, throwing sharp glimmers that danced against the rough-hewn walls. She clicked it open again, though she had done it 100 times that day already. The hands inside were still broken, frozen in place at the same moment they had been since her father's death. No matter how many times she wound it, it never moved, and yet it ticked slowly, softly, with a rhythm that wasn't powered by gears. It ticked with something else, something alive. Her father had always told her that time wasn't something you measured. It was something you carried. And as she stared at the still hands of the watch, she wondered if he had meant that literally dotted was then she heard it dot at first. She thought it was just her imagination again, the same way she sometimes thought she heard her father's voice, out in the trees, calling her name. But the sound was different. A low, steady thudding, faint at first but growing clearer. breaking through the quiet like a drumbeat from the edge of the earth. Hooves, she stiffened, her hand closing over the watch instinctively, her eyes darting toward the door. The clock inside her chest seemed to stop. She had lived alone long enough to know that uninvited riders after dark were rarely bearers of good fortune. Her father had taught her that too. Men on horseback in the night always meant a choice was coming: fight, flee or bargain. Miriam rose slowly, the creak of the chair loud in the hush, and crossed to the window. The moon hung swollen above the plains, casting a cold silver sheen over the sparse grass and the worn dirt trail leading toward the cabin. At first, there was nothing. Just the sway of distant trees, the shifting shadows of night animals. But then, through the drifting mist, she saw them, shapes, 8 of them. Riding 2 by 2, their silhouettes hard against the pale horizon, each figure broad-shouldered and deliberate in their pace. They weren't galloping, they weren't even rushing. No, they were coming steady, like they had all the time in the world. Her grip tightened around the watch until she could feel the etched design pressing into her skin. They're not passing through, she whispered to herself. They're coming here. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard stories of riders who roamed like wolves, sniffing out debts long buried, chasing ghosts of men who were long gone, but leaving their families to pay in flesh. And Miriam knew her father had lived a life of secret stories he never fully told her, names he never shared, choices he had never explained. Maybe this was the price of those secrets. The riders were closer now, close enough that the sound of leather creaking and spurs rattling joined the rhythm of their hooves. Her pulse quickened in time with them, beating louder than the strange ticking of the watch. She wanted to bolt the door, to grab the rifle that leaned by the hearth, but her body stayed rooted, her hands still locked around the thing she had. Then left to carry Dot, she could see their faces now, or rather, the shadows of them under wide-brimmed hats. Men who had seen too much sun and dust, men who looked like they didn't speak unless it was necessary. All but one, the man at the front. His face caught the moonlight, and for a moment, Miriam swore he was looking straight at her. Even from that distance, the riders slowed as they reached the edge of her land, drawing their horses into a halt just beyond the wooden fence that marked the boundary. The man at the front dismounted first, his boots hitting the dirt with a deliberate weight. He didn't walk to her door. He didn't raise a weapon. Instead, he stood there in the pale night, his hands empty, his head tilted slightly, listening. Then he spoke, his voice low and carrying like smoke across still air. "We've come for the watch." Miriam's blood went cold. Her father's words returned to her, unbidden. "If anyone ever comes asking for what I took, don't give it to them. Time isn't theirs to own." And yet here they were. 8 riders, standing on the edge of her world, claiming they knew what she carried and demanding the one thing her father had trusted her with. Dot. She glanced down at the pocket, watch in her hand. The still hands, the broken glass, the ticking. That wasn't ticking at all, but something deeper, something older. For the first time in years, Miriam was afraid of the thing she held. The fire crackled low, embers fighting against the cold sweep of the plains. Elena sat on the steps of her porch, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her hand curled around the old silver watch. It ticked softly, a stubborn reminder of time itself, a rhythm that felt louder with each passing night since the riders had arrived. She had not wound it in years, and yet its steady heart had never faltered, as though the man who once carried it had refused to let go from beyond the grave. Her father's watch was more than a keepsake. It was a burden, a story too heavy for words. Down below the ridge, where the land dipped toward the creek, the riders had pitched their camp. From where she sat, she could see the faint glow of their fire and the shifting silhouettes of men moving about in quiet urgency. They were not like the drifting drifters she sometimes saw passing through. These men carried a weight of purpose, their movements sharp, their stares unyielding even from a distance. Their presence made the night itself feel smaller, as if the world had folded in upon itself to listen to the ticking of the watch in her hand. When her father had given it to her, he hadn't spoken much. He never did. But his eyes, sharp as flint, dulled only by time and regret, had told her enough. "This is all you'll need to remember me by," he'd said, voice dry as the desert wind. At the time, Elena hadn't understood. She thought it was a simple heirloom, an old keepsake from a man who had little else to offer. Only later did she realize men had died for this watch, and more would still. She lifted the lid, watching the seconds sweep the face. There were faint scratches across the glass, and on the back, an engraving so worn it could barely be read. Yet she knew the words by heart. They were not his name, not his initials. Instead they read, "The hours we steal are the hours we owe." The first time she read it, she thought it was a riddle. The second time, she realized it was a curse. A horse snorted in the distance, breaking the silence. Her gaze flicked to the riders' camp, where one of them paced along the edge, a rifle across his shoulder. They had not asked for supper. They had not come close enough to speak since the sun went down. But their eyes had lingered on the cabin. All the while, Elena could feel the weight of their patience pressing against her. They were waiting, not for dawn, but for her to make the first move. Her father had once told her that debts in the West had longer shadows than men, she had thought. Him a bitter old drunk, speaking in riddles to ease his guilt. But now she could feel the truth of it. Debts passed from father to daughter, like blood and bone, like the ticking of a watch that never stopped. She closed her hand around it again, the metal cold and biting. For a moment, she thought of tossing it into the fire, watching the years melt away into nothing but ash and silence. But even the thought carried danger. Men who crossed deserts for a watch would not let it burn without burning her too. And so, with the night thickening around her, Elena whispered into the dark, to the riders, to her father, to time itself. "What did you steal, old man? And why must I be the one to pay it back?" The wind carried no answer, only the faint echo of the watch's ticking, steady and merciless. The nights grew heavier with each passing hour, as if the sky itself carried the burden of the questions Clara could no longer silence. She sat alone at the porch table, the watch gleaming faintly under the oil lamp, and let its ticking echo into the silence like a drumbeat of fate. She had tried in those days after the riders first arrived to convince herself that they would not return. Perhaps they had been bluffing. Perhaps the desert would swallow them whole before they found their way back. But deep down, she knew better. Riders like that never came without reason, and men who demanded time stolen by another man were not men to forget. The watch felt heavier in her palm every time she held it, its metal surface warming against her skin, almost alive. Her father had once said, "This watch doesn't tell time, Clara, it holds it." She hadn't understood then. Now, in the suffocating quiet of the prairie, she wondered if he had meant that the watch carried the memory of every moment stolen and owed. A ledger written not on paper, but in shadows. She thought of her father. More often now. His laugh, low and dangerous like thunder rolling over the plains. His hands, scarred from cards and gunfights alike, flipping the watch open, as if daring the world to count the seconds it took for him to win or lose. He had carried debts Clara had never fully known. Debts that must have twisted into the reason those 8 men were riding with her name on their tongues. Clara pressed the watch to her lips and closed her eyes, whispering to the memory of her father. What did you do? What did you take that can't be returned? On the horizon, thunder cracked though no storm rolled in. It was hooves, a distant rhythm carried by the wind. Clara's chest tightened as she rose from the porch. She walked barefoot into the dust, her long coat trailing like a second shadow, and listened. The hooves drew nearer, slower this time, deliberate, patient, as if the men knew she was waiting. She thought of the rifle leaning against the wall. Inside, thought of raising it and ending this before their faces broke the horizon. But she couldn't move. Her body was bound to the ticking in her hand, the relentless circle of time that held her still. She felt the prairie's breath, dry and hot against her cheeks, as if the land itself held its silence for the moment of their arrival. Dust began to rise in curling shapes as the riders came into view, 8 dark figures against the dying sun, their coats whipping in the wind, their hats shadowing faces carved from stone. They rode slow, their horses' heads low, the sound of leather creaking and spurs cutting into silence like whispers of judgment. Clara's eyes searched their shapes, looking for weakness, for mercy, but finding only inevitability. One of the riders raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. They reined in their horses a short distance from her cabin, dust swirling in a halo of pale fire around them. Clara stood firm, though her knees trembled. The lead rider leaned forward in his saddle, eyes sharp as broken glass. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the plain. "The time your father stole," he said, "is nearly spent. You're holding what's left." Clara clutched the watch tighter, her thumb brushing its worn engraving. She felt every second spill through her like blood, like inheritance. She wanted to scream that it wasn't hers, that she had never asked for any of it. But the words died on her tongue, strangled by the knowledge that what was owed had no intention of leaving without being paid. And as the watch ticked on, its sound rising above the silence, Clara realized that the men had not come only for her father's debt. They had come to see if she would honor it or burn with it. The night had a way of pressing down on her like a hand closing over a flame. Clara sat by the fire, her father's silver watch balanced in her palm, ticking faintly against the silence. Every mark on its scratched surface seemed alive in the glow of the flames. She ran her thumb over its edge, as though searching for answers etched into the metal. The riders had not returned since their ominous warning, but she felt them like shadows stitched into the horizon, waiting, watching. The desert air was cold, dry enough that each breath clawed its way into her lungs. She pulled her shawl tighter and stared at the watch as if it might whisper secrets of the years her father had never explained. It felt heavier tonight, as though the time it carried had begun to shift toward her shoulders. Her mind wandered to the stories she had overheard in whispers when she was a child, about her father not only being a man of trade and survival, but of betrayal and bargains. They said he had stolen more than cattle, more than gold. He had stolen time itself, or at least, moments that were not his to take. The watch was more than just a keepsake. It was a ledger, a silent witness to debts unpaid. That was what the riders meant. They weren't after land, money, or cattle. They were after the weight of those lost hours, stolen years, that no one could give back. Clara tried to laugh at the madness of it, but her throat tightened. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks spiraling upward, and she nearly flinched. Her nerves had become taut wires, humming with the knowledge that danger did not retreat with the setting sun. Out in the distance, far beyond the dark ridges of the desert, she caught sight of faint movement. 8 shapes, faint as mirages, drifting along the horizon like restless ghosts. They did not advance. They simply lingered, as if to remind her. They could close in whenever they wished. Clara's hand closed tightly around the watch. She thought of burying it, tossing it into the fire, or smashing it against a rock. But every idea crumbled as quickly as it came. Without the watch, who was she? Without the only piece of her father she still carried, what meaning would she have left? As the hours stretched on, exhaustion weighed on her bones. She remembered the way her father used to wind the watch each night, his fingers precise, his eyes distant, as though counting down towards something he alone understood. She whispered into the fire, "What did you do, Pa? What did you take?" The flames gave no answer, but the steady ticking in her hand filled the silence with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat not her own. She realized then that the watch did not belong to her anymore, if it ever had. It was a chain, an anchor, binding her to a story she did not yet know how to tell. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a coyote howled. The riders did not move. They simply remained patient, tireless, waiting for the hour when she would no longer have strength to resist. And Clara knew, with a clarity sharp as broken glass, that their reckoning was not with her father anymore. It was with her. The days that followed blurred together, each one stretching longer than the last. The sound of the wind carrying more than just dust. It carried the memory of her father's voice, his warnings, and his laugh that used to break through the hardest silences. Elara stayed close to the pocket watch, winding it carefully at the same hour each evening, as though the turning gears would somehow keep the world from spinning out of control. Yet even as the watch ticked with steady patience, her own heart stumbled with uncertainty. She could feel the 8 riders still out there, watching from beyond the ridges, as if they were waiting for something she had not yet offered, perhaps the truth, perhaps her surrender. On the 3rd morning after their last encounter, she woke to find a trail of hoofprints not 50 paces from her cabin, curving close and then pulling away again like a predator circling prey. She stepped outside, barefoot, the cold ground pressing against her skin, and stared into the horizon. There were no men in sight, no horses, no dust, yet she knew. They wanted her to know they had been there. They wanted her to understand the time her father had stolen was running thin, and that her own reckoning was closing in. Inside, she sat at the rough-hewn table, the pocket watch lying open before her, its ticking loud in the stillness. Her hands trembled as she traced the faint etchings inside the lid, the initials she had memorized since childhood. Not her father's, but another man's. A name she had never spoken aloud. Carved into silver, J.W. It struck her then that this was no simple watch, no trinket of sentiment. It was a marker, a stolen promise, perhaps even blood-stained. The riders were not chasing shadows, they were chasing justice. And she, by blood and by inheritance, was tied to it. That night, she lit a lantern and sat on the porch, forcing herself to stay awake. The desert was alive in ways it rarely was during the day. The call of coyotes, the whisper of brush swaying, the stars cutting through the darkness like blades. She wondered if her father, when he first pressed the watch into her hands, had known this moment would come. She wondered if he had wanted her to face it or to flee. Her chest tightened as she remembered his words, spoken with a voice ragged from years of hardship. One day, Elara, you'll have to decide if you're running from my past, or if you're going to stand and face it. The decision weighed on her heavier than the riders themselves. To run meant leaving behind everything she had built, every memory rooted in that cabin, every ghost she still spoke to in the quiet. To stay meant to risk meeting those 8 men head-on, knowing their questions might demand answers she did not yet have, or perhaps answers that would unravel everything she thought she knew about the man who raised her dot as dawn broke. The sound finally came, distant hoofbeats, low and rhythmic, like the steady tolling of a funeral bell. Her heart pounded in time with the approaching rhythm, the watch in her palm ticking furiously, as though mocking her fear. She stood, breath-catching, in her throat, and whispered to the wind as if her father might hear her still. Time's up, isn't it? The horizon bled red as the riders appeared, silhouetted against the rising sun. Their numbers clear now, 8 shadows, fanning across the desert like a storm. Elara did not move, not yet. She waited, the watch clenched in her fist, her eyes unblinking. She was no longer the daughter who hid behind her father's shadow. She was the woman who would decide what to do with the time he left behind. The sun rose slowly, spilling gold across the cracked earth and illuminating the tension in the desert air. Elara's chest heaved, the weight of the pocket watch pressing against her palm as if it were a living heartbeat, its ticking matching the rhythm of her own. Each step of the approaching riders sent small plumes of dust spiraling into the sky, and with each plume, She felt the years of solitude crash upon her like a wave she could no longer evade. They were close now, their horses' hooves drumming. A steady, relentless cadence that echoed in her bones. Her mind flashed back to the cabin, the sparse furniture, the scattered belongings of a life she had tried to build without interference. She had learned to be self-reliant, to trust only the rhythm of the wind and the quiet of dawn. But now that solitude was fractured. The 8 men were not here to admire her resilience. They were here to reclaim what her father had taken, to answer questions left unasked for decades. And somewhere among them, there was a man whose gaze lingered too long, whose presence seemed oddly detached from the rest, as if he had crossed the threshold into her life with a purpose beyond the simple recovery of a stolen item. Elara took a steadying breath and held the watch out before her, the sunlight glinting off its polished surface. Each tick reverberated through her arms like a warning, like a summons. The riders slowed as they neared the clearing, the wind carrying a faint scent of leather and gunpowder. Their leader dismounted with deliberate care, boots sinking into the dry soil, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. "You've been waiting a long time." The man's voice carried over the clearing, calm but edged with steel. "We all have questions. And you, I suppose, have some answers." Elara didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the group, noting the hardened expressions, the faint glint of weapons and the subtle hesitation of one rider slightly apart from the others. There was fear in the air, yes, but also recognition, an acknowledgement that the past was alive and demanding its due. The watch thumped in her hand, heavier now, almost as though it knew the moment had come for her to face the truth. With a deep, steadying breath, she took her first step toward them. Dust rose in spirals, the early morning light catching every particle like embers floating in the wind. Her voice was steady, firm. "I will answer what I can. But know this, I am not your enemy. I am only what remains." The lead rider tilted his head, considering her words, while the others remained poised like statues, the horses shifting restlessly beneath them. Somewhere deep in the silence, a subtle tension wound tighter, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Elara's pulse raced, yet she felt a strange clarity. Her father's past had led them here. Yes, but her choices would define what came next. And as the first words were exchanged, as the history between the stolen time and the women's life began to unravel, Elara understood that she was no longer a passive witness. She was a participant in a story that would stretch far beyond the desert, far beyond the watch, far beyond the legacy of a man whose sins had finally caught up with her. Dusk fell slowly over the desert, casting long, eerie shadows across the rocky terrain. Elara had moved to the hilltop, her boots dug into the coarse earth, fingers tightening around the familiar weight of the silver pocket watch. The wind lashed at her coat, tugging at her hair, and the chill of the evening bit at her skin. From below, the 8 riders circled like predators, each movement deliberate, measured, and silent, but deadly in its intent. She had spent countless nights alone, listening to the wind's whispers and deciphering the world's subtle cues. Tonight, the wind carried something more, an urgency, a warning, a reminder that the solitude she had relied upon for years was no longer hers. The riders were relentless, their eyes fixed, their intentions unspoken but evident in every flick of a wrist and every twitch of a spurred boot. Her mind replayed the echoes of her father's misdeeds. The stolen timepiece, the legacy of betrayal that had finally brought these men to her doorstep. She could not run. There was nowhere to hide. Instead, she steeled herself, focusing on the rhythm of the watch, its ticking resonating with her heartbeat. Each pulse seemed to synchronize with the wind's howl, creating a strange harmony between fear and courage. One rider, slightly apart from the others, seemed less aggressive, almost hesitant. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. It was a subtle spark, but it reminded her that not every arrival was an enemy. that not every intention was filled with malice. Yet, the tension in the circle below was undeniable. Any misstep could ignite violence in an instant. Elara lifted the watch higher, letting the last rays of the sun glint off its polished surface. Shadows stretched across the rocks, exaggerated and twisted by the dying light, creating the illusion of multiple threats converging upon her. She inhaled deeply, letting the sharp desert air fill her lungs. Feeling the grounding weight of both fear and resolve, her voice broke the silence, steady and clear. You seek answers. You will find them, but know this. The truth does not come easily, and it is heavier than you imagine. The lead rider dismounted, his boots crunching against gravel, and his companions followed suit. The horses stirred restlessly, their snorts mingling with the wind, creating a chorus that echoed across the hilltop. Elara felt the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the subtle vibrations of the approaching confrontation, and the undeniable pull of destiny that had led these men, these seekers of time and truth, to her. Tonight would be pivotal. Choices made in the fading light of dusk would ripple forward, shaping the narrative of both the watch and the woman who had held it against the world's relentless march. And as the first words were exchanged, the desert seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging that the long-awaited reckoning had finally arrived. Night had swallowed the desert whole, turning every ridge and crevice into a shadow-laden expanse. Elara's breath fogged in the cold air, her fingers wrapped tightly around the silver watch that had been her anchor through years of solitude. She could feel the vibrations of the horses below, restless and tense, like wild predators waiting for the final strike. Each rider's gaze was fixed on her, the unspoken challenge between the woman and the 8 men hanging in the air like an invisible rope pulled taut. She had moved carefully, calculating every step, every gesture, the rhythm of the night guiding her decisions. The moon hung low, casting silver light that danced across the rocks and sand, illuminating the glint of spurred boots, the polished barrels of rifles, and the grim determination etched into the faces of the riders. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the awareness that this night would determine the fate of her father's legacy and her own survival. The woman shifted her weight slightly, her eyes scanning each figure, memorizing every detail, the lean of a shoulder, the flare of a nostril, the faint twitch of a finger near a holster. She recognized patterns, anticipated movements, and calculated possibilities. One rider seemed hesitant, the same one from earlier, the flicker of doubt in his eyes conflicting with the unyielding resolve of the others. That hesitation was both a risk and an opportunity, a fragile crack in the otherwise seamless wall of danger surrounding her. A tense silence fell, broken only by the rustling of leather, the soft snorts of horses, and the faint ticking of the watch held in her hand. That ticking was more than a sound, it was a heartbeat, a reminder of time lost, time stolen, and the inexorable passage toward confrontation. She lifted the watch slightly, letting the moonlight catch it, creating a flash that drew the attention of all 8 riders simultaneously. The lead rider stepped forward, boots crunching on the sand, his shadow stretching long behind him. "The time has come," he said, voice calm but firm. "We've come for answers, and you hold them all." Elara met his gaze evenly, feeling the weight of generations pressing down upon her. "Answers come at a price," she replied. "And tonight, that price will be paid." The desert seemed to hold its breath as the first move was made, a single, deliberate step forward that would ignite the sequence of choices, confrontations, and revelations that had been building for years. The night air crackled with anticipation, each heartbeat a drumbeat to the final moments of reckoning, where loyalty, truth, and survival would collide under the stark gaze of the moon. The woman's grip on the watch tightened, her eyes locking on the lead rider, and the desert whispered a warning. In the Wild West, time held power, and tonight, every second would matter more than ever before. The first light of dawn crept over the desert horizon, painting the rocky outcrop in muted oranges and golds, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the sand and stones. Elara stood tall, her silhouette firm against the rising sun. Silver pocket watch clutched in her hand, its polished surface catching the early light and reflecting a promise, a challenge, and a reckoning all at once. Around her, the 8 riders adjusted their positions, a living circle of calculated precision, eyes sharp, bodies taut with anticipation. For years she had lived in the solitude of the desert, letting the wind guide her, the sun mark her hours, and the stars shape her nights. The legacy of her father's theft, the stolen moments of time encapsulated in this single watch, had brought these men to her. Each carried a purpose, a story, and a claim to the hours and minutes her father had. Once taken, and now they demanded their reckoning. Elara's gaze swept across the circle. She had studied them for days, predicted their movements, understood the subtle shifts in weight, the flicker of an eye, the restless shifting of hands near holsters. Tonight, or rather this dawn, would be the culmination of that preparation. Every step, every breath, and every heartbeat had led to this precarious equilibrium, where survival and truth balanced on a knife's edge. The lead rider stepped forward, his boots silent against the stones. "The time is yours to give," he said, voice steady, carrying the weight of authority and expectation. "Show us what it means." Elara raised the watch, letting the morning light ignite its silver face. She exhaled slowly, centering herself in the quiet storm of tension that surrounded her. "Time is not given lightly," she replied. "It is earned, understood, and respected. And today, you will learn what that truly means." A hush fell over the desert, broken only by the soft shifting of horses and the distant cry of a morning bird. Then, with deliberate movement, she set the watch into the ground, its ticking resonating like a heartbeat through the canyon. The men watched, transfixed, understanding that the legacy they sought was intertwined not with vengeance or theft, but with wisdom, courage, and the unyielding spirit of the woman who had held time in her hands all these years. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the desert in full light, the riders lowered their weapons, a silent acknowledgement passing among them. Elara had not only survived, she had imparted a lesson far greater than any single moment of stolen time. The watch was no longer just a symbol of her father's past. It was a testament to her resilience, insight, and the indomitable strength required to face the weight of history and emerge unbroken. The desert exhaled along with her, and in that moment, the sun, the sand, and the silver watch marked a new beginning, the reclamation of time, the respect for legacy, and the understanding that some truths like the wind and the horizon were eternal, untouchable, and unbound by human hands.